Okay, hello and welcome to MS Dynamics World's Fall Document Management Series. I'm Jason Gumpert and I am really happy to have you all with us here today for this event. I am happy to be joined today by Jim Just of iMerge Consulting. Jim is a real expert in workflow, business process management, records management, and enterprise content management technologies and best practices. So we have the right person here for the event, and he's got in addition, many years of experience with business process automation. So we're really pleased to have Jim with us today, and we invite you to add your feedback and questions throughout the session. There are a few ways you can do this. First, you can use the Q&A and chat blocks that you should see to the right of the slides, and we encourage you to ask your questions there anytime. Jim will be pausing to take questions throughout the session. We also invite you to add your thoughts and comments and questions on Twitter. We'll be following the session at MSDW Doc Management, that's MSDW-DOC-MGMT, as a hashtag, and we'll look for questions there as well. So without further delay, please allow me to welcome Jim Just.
Thanks a lot, Adam. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Jim Just with iMerge Consulting. I'm speaking to you today from West Bend, Wisconsin. And for everybody on the Eastern Seaboard, we hope you are faring well, and we hope everything you're safe and things get back to normal quickly. I want to start by just a brief agenda. We'll be talking briefly about defining what workflow really is. We'll talk about some of the benefits of using workflow, some of the workflow landscape, kind of what's out there today and how you might use it and what the right workflow is for you. We're going to talk about deploying workflow and how to do it right, and I've just got a list of resources. As Adam mentioned, we'll be accepting questions throughout, and when we reach logical breakpoints, if Adam has some questions, he'll jump in and we'll try to answer them right then. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for some questions as well. So the first thing we want to do is really define workflow. The classic definition is really technology neutral. It's the process by which individual tasks come together to complete a transaction within an enterprise. That from the Association of Image and Information Management, which really talks to just the basics of, we do things, we do it in a process to get work done. If we look at kind of a modern definition from Delphi Group, really this is a technology-based traditional workflow definition, set of methods and technologies for the proactive analysis, compression, and automation of information-based tasks and activities. So this is getting to some of the value proposition of using workflow in terms of doing more than just tracking and completing tasks, but actually doing process improvement and work improvement. And then my definition is sort of more simple. It says it's really an orchestration engine. At its heart, workflow being a database-driven solution has the ability to orchestrate many different kinds of information, many different kinds of tasks, many different kinds of people, even data, business systems that you may have. So we'll see an example of that later of how workflow can orchestrate processes within an organization. There's a lot of confusion out there about what is business process management versus workflow. So I thought it was important to just kind of briefly point out what those differences are, and to the extent that it's not a gray area, try to let you know how to think about it. BPM, or workflow rather, really historically focused on orchestrating document flow. So if you go back about 20 years when people started scanning documents, they really wanted to start scanning them at the beginning of processes, not at the end. And as soon as you started scanning at the beginning of a process, historically, paper was the driver for the process, a file folder or a document move from one person's outbox to another person's inbox. Well, if you scan at the beginning, that goes away, so you need a way to orchestrate that document movement without having physical documents anymore. Pretty logical. So along came the technology called workflow. BPM, business process management, really evolved to orchestrate data through the enterprise. IBM MQ series workflow was, or MQ series, sorry, was probably one of the first ones. IBM's MQ series workflow was the traditional ECM workflow product. So BPM evolved more to orchestrate data from one system to another, or from one enterprise to another within a greater organization. So in my little graphic here, we can see that you could have information in Dynamics being picked up by BPM and flowing to SAP financials at a world headquarters, for example, or Salesforce.com sales information and CRM information might be flowing up to financials or might be flowing back to Dynamics. So two-way communication of data through the enterprise. But historically, over the last probably 5 to 6 years, the two have become synonymous. Workflow more and more can orchestrate data without documents, and BPM systems can orchestrate documents along with data. So for the sake of this discussion, we're using workflow, but just understand that, you know, BPM is sort of the big brother of workflow, more focused on data orchestration, and traditional workflow, ECM workflow or standalone workflow, is more focused on document orchestration, but not necessarily. There's a lot of overlap and blur between the two. So if there's any questions on that, let Adam know, and we'll host them when he gets them. So from a workflow benefit standpoint, probably one of the biggest benefits of workflow is the ability to codify processes. By codifying processes, you standardize your operations, you simplify training. There's a huge number of benefits to standardization. You know, in traditional businesses, workflows are pretty organic. They're pretty manual. They're subject to variations to a large degree. That's not to say that workflow doesn't allow for variation. It certainly does. But codifying processes gives you all the value of eliminating variability. And when you think about it, it's really the heart of the Kaizen and Six Sigma movement, is standard operating and procedures and standardized operations. So codifying processes can't be understated. It's a huge benefit. One of the other big benefits of workflow is the fact that it's driven by business rules. So whether you're talking about moving work into queues for people to work from, or implementing actions based on state changes, the business rules underlie the workflow, and that drives everything. So business rules are easy to write down. They're easy to put into manuals. They're easy to break when they're manual. But when you codify them and have them in an automated process, the business rules pretty much drive things automatically. And they can really run off of any kind of state change. So that state change could be a priority change. It could be a value change, a time change, really whatever state change might drive the process. It could even be a data element in Dynamics itself or another business system. Timers are a kind of state change. Timers really talk about time-based timers, if you will. A timer might be on let's say that you have a process that it's a high priority process, so it has a 1 hour time frame to complete it. If you set a timer that at 45 minutes, if no one has claimed that task, then it gets escalated. So a timer is watching, you know, every second, millisecond, whatever, it's checking to see what's going on, and when it hits that timer, it does the escalation business rule that you defined. What's really cool about that is an escalation can be, you know, for any kind of state change, can be anything. It can be send an email, send a text message, leave a phone message, make a light flash, you know, sound an alarm, whatever you want to do, really. So if you can reach out and touch it with a database, you can make it happen with workflow. So that's a pretty powerful benefit of using workflow. So a couple others are database integration. Obviously, workflow is a database-driven system. So in the process of inputting data into a workflow task, you can validate it against any business system that you might have. You can also push and pull data. So let's say, for example, I key in a vendor number as part of a workflow transaction. Maybe it's an exception that I'm dealing with, and I want to look up documents that relate to that vendor. When I key in the vendor number, I can validate that, yeah, I keyed it in correctly, but I can also pull back from the database the vendor name, the current status, outstanding payments, what checks are in process, any kind of information I want. Really not too unlike the kind of things you do with CRMs. So a database can also push data if you are entering data into a transaction, given that you follow the data rules of the business system. You can push that data back out as well. Again, because this is underlied by a database, everything that you do is in an audit trail. Every action, whether it's an automated action or manual action, is audited. So you get that accountability that everybody likes to see. The accountability can be internal, can be just knowing who did what and whether they did it right. But you can also prove accountability to regulatory agencies, for example, oversight groups, the EPA, in a utility, it might be a citizens utility board. Yeah, we did what we said we were going to do. So that auditability and accountability is really one of the drivers for a lot of organizations for implementing workflow. And again, sometimes that accountability is internal, but more often it's from external sources, auditors, et cetera. So really can't understate the value proposition of having that full audit trail of everything that happens. When it comes to things like electronic signatures or approvals within a workflow task, of course, that's audited as well. So you can go back and see who approved, who denied, who perhaps abstained from approving something or requested more information. So again, all of that's captured in the audit trail, and it's all there for you to report on. And might seem like kind of a small item, but retention is assigned. So for that transaction, for a document that might be flowing through workflow, you assign the lifecycle control, and that's automated just by the fact that a document or a electronic form or a task is being executed within that state of the workflow. The user doesn't have to think about it, it's just done. And I can tell you from the standpoint of a merge, a lot of our consulting work these days is really coming from the legal, from the records retention, from the records management side of things, not from the traditional content management side. So it is a big deal. Whether or not you recognize it as a big deal in your own organization, it probably is at some level in the corporate counsel's office. So again, because we're gathering all this data, we can do a lot with it. This is an example of a workflow dashboard from a vendor. You see that in the top, this is actually a higher education admissions workflow. So in the top left corner, we have a list of applicants that are in the queue. Just below that, we have some admissions review queuing information, what's been done so far in the queues for each of the review types. We have a retrieval panel at the bottom left. Up at the top right, we have results of a file search looking for documents that relate to various, in this case, student applicants. And then in the bottom right, we have another panel that was plugged in to see what kind of decisions are being made on applicants. So this is pretty typical of a workflow dashboard, being able to display panels of information, not unlike you have a web part in SharePoint. It's the ability to see what's going on graphically or in lists, whatever's appropriate. At a management level or, at the level that people need to see it. So it's pretty exciting. Again, once you automate your workflow, you're gathering data, you might as well take advantage of that data, right? A lot of companies push that data even into data warehouses. So from a workflow summary standpoint, benefit summary, really what we're talking about here is creating nimble, adaptive organizations. Nimble organizations, as we know, are competitive. They have a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Because you've codified your rules, it's easier to make changes and to train staff when those processes are changed. I think that's really important because if you have a lot of manual processes, the training takes a lot longer. It's a lot harder to implement. It's a lot harder to keep the standards. It delivers the right information where and when it is needed. So whether it's data from a data system or a document or an Eform, based on what I'm doing and when I'm doing it, I can automatically present it with that set of information. You have visibility across the processes and across all instances of the processes that are running. So again, that dashboard idea of, hey, I know what's going on. I don't have to send out emails or hunt down file folders. If I want to know where a process is for a customer, for a vendor, whatever, all I have to do is look at the workflow and I know exactly where it is and exactly what's next. I can see what's been approved and what's been denied, et cetera. So really nice to have that visibility in real time into everything that's going on in the organization that's being controlled by workflow. It's cross-system and cross-functional. So again, I'm not limited just to the workflow within my CRM or the workflow within my ERP. The broader workflow solutions go across everything. And it really, what I like about workflow is it provides you with, sorry, I've got to advance my slide here. It supplies you with new ways of working. It gives you new ways to do work and new ways to think about work. New ways to engage with your customers, with your vendors, with all of your, your broader organization. So I really like that a lot. I think it's one of the biggest benefits of workflow is that inventiveness of being able to do things in new ways, different ways, of being proactive instead of reactive. So seen a lot of use of things like emails to vendors when there's an exception based on a receipt of inventory, or an email to an employee if they filled out a vacation request wrong, or they requested 5 days and they only have 4.5 days available. Again, workflow can be very proactive in the way that it engages with all the participants. So that's the benefits side. Adam, do we have any questions popping up so far? Sorry,
no
Jason.
Questions that no problem. No questions that I see at this time, but we do encourage everyone to share their thoughts as they have questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm sorry, Jason shows up as Adam on my screen here. So
yeah, I'm to blame for that.
Yeah, you are. But okay, so we'll go into the workflow landscape now. One of the most ubiquitous workflow solutions out there right now is, of course, email. It is in effect used as a very simplistic workflow by virtually every organization, really. The nice thing about it is you can do anything with it you want. The bad thing about it is there's no database to back it up. It's very simplistic, more or less sequential, and it's dependent on each recipient and each sender to keep track of what they did and whether they've gotten responses back. So lacking any kind of business rules or data system underlying it, it's pretty simplistic. Almost as ubiquitous these days is SharePoint. Many of you probably are using SharePoint in some way, but SharePoint is and with the workflow foundations built into the operating system of Windows, offers a lot of opportunities for organizations, and it can be leveraged for very simple out-of-the-box approval workflows, or you can do a whole bunch of coding and make it into a much more heavy-lifting workflow product. And, of course, you can add on third-party workflow solutions to make it easier to deploy, but still keep that underlying SharePoint technology. I'd say probably in terms of desktops of workflow being deployed today, SharePoint is far and away the largest, probably by a factor of 100. It's simply too easy to deploy, and organizations are absolutely taking advantage of it. Then there's workflow that's part of an ERP system or a CRM or other systems that might be in place. HRIS systems, for example, is another good example of an offshoot of an ERP. So things like Microsoft Dynamics, ERP, and CRM. They tend to be more transaction-centric, though. They tend to live within the system itself. You don't tend to write use Microsoft Dynamics inbuilt workflow functionality to manage workflows out of an HRIS system, for example. So they tend to be system-centric and transaction data-centric. They tend not to do a very good job of handling supporting documents. So they have their place, and it's obviously very important to understand what that place is. Attachments, when you attach them within, an ERP system, typically are out on the shared drive. They might leverage SharePoint and store the documents in SharePoint as well, but typically they're out on a shared drive. So you lose that records management, life cycle control, ability to easily purge that you have within an ECM and a workflow system. Dynamics Flow, which is coming into place in around 2014, this is for the CRM, is going to embrace a lot of workflow-like functionality. So I think that's really fabulous that we're seeing the merging of the technologies between the traditional kind of workflow approach to things and the Dynamics Flow. So more of that's going to be coming out in the future. Great article on the MS Dynamics magazine website right now that you can read up on those plans. So keep an eye on that as well. So then there's the more traditional enterprise content management system workflow, which again, as I said at the outset, was more document-centric. Has that lifecycle control built into it. Maybe less data-centric, but still able to, most workflow systems are able to handle some level of data. That's not a given. I have to say that that's not a given. There are ECM workflows that do a very good job of orchestrating data, and there's some that are still document-centric. So you have to be very careful, depending on what you want to do with workflow, what workflow you select and use. Then there's pure workflow. Again, spin off sort of the ECM world and the BPM world. They aren't reliant on any kind of back end for document control. They really link to any system that's out there, any email system, any document store system, whether it's SharePoint or an ECM vendor. They connect anything. So pretty much looked at as an open architecture solution, best of breed kind of that you use to link together anything in your enterprise that you need to communicate with. And finally, the idea of business process management, which is again that umbrella technology and that overlays many functions, many systems, and orchestrates data and documents throughout the enterprise. And one of the workflow solutions a lot of people overlook is Eforms. And we did a study for the Kansas Department of Transportation, and coming out of that study, they're by far and away the highest value proposition in a technology deployment for them was electronic forms. They had literally hundreds of forms that automated with simple approval routing workflows were of huge value to the organization. So replacing physical forms or stupid forms that are things like Word documents or PDF documents that are simply fill and print or fill and send. Instead, if you go to electronic forms, you get a lot more automation capability, that same kind of database validation, pushing and pulling of data based on data entered into an eForm, triggering routing options, for example. So a lot of times eForms are part of workflow, but eForms themselves typically have workflow of their own that's relatively simplistic, but still very usable. Adobe, obviously is the 800-pound gorilla, and then Microsoft products and things like SharePoint are the other. But don't overlook that eForm capability. Jason,
we had a question come. We did have a question come in, and it was the question was, do you know of any plans to expand the Dynamics Flow user experience to the Dynamics ERP products? I'm not sure if this is something that's really something you have a deep focus on, or but I could give that one a shot if you like.
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead and take that.
Sure. So, I mean, my understanding right now, and it is definitely relevant to this particular point in the presentation, is that I have not heard of any plans to move the Flow user experience to the ERP products. However, I think the interesting thing to watch, and it's something we're certainly going to be covering in more detail moving forward, is the development of new Windows 8 applications that I think attempt the same idea of injecting workflow into the UI itself across all the Dynamics ERP products, in the next year. So that was definitely something of interest to watch.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is really this trend in Microsoft's world started with Windows 2007 or Windows 7, and the ability to they started embedding the foundations for that, understanding what a person is doing and where they are doing it, and that really was expressed in the Workflow Foundations set of attributes that are built into Windows 7 and 8. So I think Microsoft is starting to lay the groundwork back then, and they're exposing that more and more with these kinds of initiatives. I think it's absolutely fabulous. So thank you for that, Jason. So another spin-off, if you will, or variation on workflow is case management. Now, I want to spend a minute talking about case management because it is kind of, I hate to use the term, but it is a special case. Let's use a human services example, like a county human services department. You might have a woman who has 2 children, and she has health issues. She's on Medicaid, and because of that, she has Medicaid documentation. She has home medical equipment. She has nursing services, and that all rolls up into a social service case that deals with that mother. But in the bigger world, the mother has there's the mother, there's the father, there's 2 children. In my example here, the father's homeless, so he has outreach in the homeless world, and he has a case manager, and he has a social service workers, and might be engaging with religious organizations. One of the children might be in foster care, so you have the child's case, you have the foster care family's a case as well, and then you have child 2 that's living with grandma, so you have the number 2 child has its case, and grandma has her case because because the child is in her care. Social services wants to know what's going on with her. So the family case is really 6 or more separate cases that all have to be orchestrated together within perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 different social workers universes and across many different state and local agencies. So case management really looks at those interrelationships, and it builds data models to track and manage all those different interrelationships. So if you have case type work, insurance, a claim is a case in insurance, for example, you may have complex cases, and you might want to look at some of the case management tools that are out there and some of the vendors that provide them. So I think it's important to understand that exists. So let's talk about which workflow you might want to use, or we might want to think about using. In the center here is the data-centric workflows, the low volume of documents. It might be 10 or 15, maybe as many as 50 to 100 documents a day, but certainly not thousands of documents being received and flowed in a given day. That would be difficult to manage with a line of business workflow. So line of business workflows like Dynamics or Dynamics CRM or even PeopleSoft and SAP really aren't appropriate for high document volume flowing through them and being saved, to records within them. But if it's workflow within the data-centric solution, certainly that's the first place to look, is that line of business workflow. The second is more of a higher volume document-centric workflow. It might be crossing business units, crossing line of business systems. So you might be moving between HRIS and accounting systems, or between supply chain side of things and maybe a different group that might be dealing with exceptions or audit or that type of thing. So again, if you get into that higher volume of document management where you're receiving, scanning, receiving emails, receiving electronic documents as attachments or through a portal, that document-centric would drive you more towards an ECM workflow. And if it's really CRM-oriented, you might be within the CRM, but with the caution, again, that's why it's kind of reduced in size there, the caution that a CRM workflow really doesn't have the legs to support high document volume and the lifecycle management of documents over time. So again, document-centric, ECM-oriented would be the place to look. Where you have more data orchestration, more BPM-like activities, then you look more at the BPM workflow solutions. So that cross-system, with or without documents, really you look at that more BPM. But as I said earlier, there's a gray area between an ECM workflow or more document-centric workflow and BPM workflows because they do overlap in functionality these days. So if you have systems, know the systems that you have, understand what they do and what their limitations are, understand whether, if you have an ECM, whether the workflow that came with the ECM can do a decent job of orchestrating data. So that's, know what you have and use the right tool for the problem at hand. It's not always that obvious, but, as you become familiar with the solutions in your organization, it shouldn't be too hard to sort out which one makes the most sense. I have a insurance client right now that has implementing a new underwriting system, and that underwriting system is very simplistic workflow tools. So the caution I had for them is, don't do a lot of custom development in that new underwriting system if you start finding that you're exceeding the logical break of custom coding to make it work versus buying something off the shelf. You want to make sure that you look at an off-the-shelf product before you invest too much in custom coding. So hopefully that helps kind of guide where you might use what kind of workflow, and if you have more questions on that, I'd be glad to talk about it. So let's look at a workflow orchestration example. Onboarding is common to every organization, whether you're replacing a position or hiring a new employee for a new position, there's a lot of stuff that has to happen behind the scenes. So in this case, let's say we're doing a new hire. Well, when you do the new hire, usually it's the manager that initiates it. He might talk to human resources. They may have existing candidates that they can plug in, or they have to go out and bring in a pool of candidates. Eventually, the manager is going to say, yeah, I'm going to hire this person. Well, lots of stuff has to happen. There's security things that have to happen. We have to add the new user to LDAP. We have to add them to the line of business systems that we have. We have to get them a key card. Those line of business systems might be your CRM, might be the ERP, the HRIS, the ECM. So there's a lot of different onboarding tasks just dealing with security alone. Then there's the physical part of onboarding. They need a PC, they need a desk, they need the physical space. Do we have a cubicle for them? Do we need to build it? Do we have to buy the PC? Do we have to refresh an existing PC? So that stuff has to happen over in IT land as well. We have telecommunications issues that have to get handled. We need an office phone, we need a cell phone that has to be bought and activated. Do they need remote access? Do they need a VPN? Do they need Citrix access? So all that stuff has to happen. Well, the poor manager that's doing the hire, they don't know what all those tasks are, and neither does HR for that matter. So in a lot of organizations, all those different pieces, and as we all know, there's more than this, have to be handled in some way, and usually that's done with email and without a whole lot of underlying technology. So in the workflow world, that stuff happens very automatically. Workflow can be very simple. It can be nothing more than an Eform that you fill out and then manually check off as the actors do their work. So, HR does their work, they say that it's completed, and the next step happens. And when the new hire takes place, somebody checks off that the new hire took place, and then a whole bunch of actions can be generated and tasks can be generated for IT and the desktop folks and the telecommunication folks and the physical space folks, and anybody that needs to be notified can be. And as they complete their work, they check it off. But at least the poor manager then has one place to go to find out whether or not their new hire, when they walk in the door on Monday, is going to have some place to sit and have a PC to work with. But you can be more sophisticated. You can have a more complex eForm. The eForm might, for example, if you say, well, they need Dynamics access for ERP, well, it can then ask them, okay, what department are they in? Based on the department, it can ask, well, which of the Dynamics security groups do they belong to? And the workflow can actually go and update Dynamics when that new hire action actually takes place. So, again, there's a lot of things that can take place automated behind the scenes. Being more sophisticated, we can route in parallel to multiple actors simultaneously and keep track of what they've done. So as the facilities folks make sure that the cubicle is there and the chair is there and the lights are on and there's power, and the IT telecom people make sure that the port is activated and the phone works and all that, they can be checking that off, and email can be messaging back to the hiring manager that, yeah, this stuff has been done. If approvals are needed for buying a new PC, that can happen right at the same time, right within the workflow. And you go really automated, workflow can monitor the hire status in the HRIS. So when the HR folks flip the switch and say, yeah, we're hiring, Adam in this position, automatically workflow picks that up and off it goes, creating all the tasks for everybody in the system. And the Eform can capture rules variables like, what's the start date, what's the department, what role are they in, and then it can go off and automatically update systems like Dynamics or LDAP or trigger the keycard security system and that type of thing. So again, you can start very simple, which I recommend, and then as you go along, you keep adding more and more functionality. And I just kind of like the onboarding because it's such a common application across every single organization. And the flip side of that is offboarding. If you have an aggressive separation where security walks in at 8 in the morning and asks an employee to leave, you want to shut down all that security access instantly. And again, once you've built it for onboarding, you can flip it around for offboarding pretty darn easily and turn off all those systems and turn off the access and turn off the key card. So again, pretty cool stuff you can do. Again, you might not think of everything day one, but as you start working with workflow, you're going to find out that there's many new ways of working that can be introduced into the system, your systems. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about deploying workflow. Jason, any input from the crowd right now?
I'm not seeing anything else right now, but I think it is a good point to maybe invite people to think more about what kind of processes they've been waiting to automate or wanting to automate, and maybe that's something we can come back to later.
That'd be great. If somebody has a process they absolutely are, is on the drawing board, shoot that out, and we can talk about some things that I've seen in best practice. Excuse me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about best practices in deploying workflow. The first thing that you have to understand is the Pareto's law comes into play here. The 80% of the work goes into the analysis, and 20% goes into deployment. A lot of work goes into making sure that you understand how your process works today and what you want out of automation for the future. And we'll touch on that a little bit in a second as well. So when you're doing that kind of a deployment, you need a team. You need a management team that's supporting the deployment. You need a core team that's executing the deployment, and you need all the support services that go around it. So in a larger, A large organization is going to have more players. A smaller organization is going to have fewer players. But the kinds of things you need for the management team, you need, Chief Information Officer input. You need the Senior VP input from the group that's looking at doing the automation. You need operational input, and you need legal input. And those folks have to be on board and know that this process redesign, this process automation is going on, so that you're not waiting, months to get an SVP to sign off on a change you want to do. Again, the simpler the workflow, the less involvement of folks you need, and the more complex and larger organization, the more you need. But, in general, you need these kinds of inputs on process redesign. The core workflow team, that can be a lot of different folks. Obviously, you're going to need subject matter experts that deal with the processes today. You're going to need the department heads so that they're buying in on the changes you're making. If the process crosses departments, obviously you need the subject matter experts from all of the departments, and you need the department management from all the departments. You need you need a strong project manager that keeps track of everything and keeps the project on, moving forward and on time and on scope. You need business analysts. You need line of business system experts. If you want to reach out and touch, SAP at the home office, you got to be talking to somebody who's an SAP expert at the home office. You need your IT liaisons for your network, network connections, database connections, ODBC, opening up ports, whatever it is you need. And you need your non-core liaisons. So that, again, might be a legal person, might be HR if you're dealing with a union environment, might be union stewards. There's lots of different folks that can get involved in a major redesign project. If you're taking one simple form and running it through a couple of approvals and you just want to automate that and see how it goes, obviously this is a lot simpler. So your support team can be your IT experts, your non-core department liaisons, your vendor workflow experts, especially in the first deployment. I really recommend that you engage with the vendor. And you might need a business process reengineering consultant on the project as well. So your role will vary depending on who you are and where you are in the organization. You might be wearing lots of hats, especially in a small IT organization. In a department that's doing this workflow deployment and redesign, there might be one key SME that's wearing a lot of different hats in terms of developing those current and future state designs and that type of thing. So it varies by department, by organization, and by size, but it's really important that those roles are well defined, that you know who's doing what, and that you are given the time to do the work. Obviously, if you're paving the cow path, that's a lot easier than a major redesign, but you need to make sure resources are allocated and that everyone's on board. So my law of workflow deployment is that workflow deployment success is inversely proportional to the deployment time. So in other words, if processes take too long to deploy, workflow redesign processes, they'll tend to never get done, because even as you're deploying, the process is changing. People are reassigned, reorganizations, you name it, you all know what happens. You need to make sure that you scope these things in a way that they get done fairly quickly. So we'll touch on that again, but just keep in mind that you want to keep the scope manageable. So the steps to success include defining your current state process. If you don't know what you do today, it's pretty hard to automate it. You got to know what you're doing today. You don't have to overkill it, but it's really good to do a process map and define your business rules and to define your business system touch points. Then you look at your future state. Okay, well, now that we have this great technology, how are we going to deploy it? How are we going to use it? What is that future state going to look like? Again, thinking about keeping that scope defined enough and refined enough that we aren't exceeding that 6 to 6 months limit, I guess I'm going to put on it. You don't want to really go much longer than that. And make sure you establish your metrics. Why? Because when this is all done, you want to be able to go back and show that this automating stuff really works, that this workflow stuff really adds value, and that it's good for the organization. So you want to know how many folks are involved and what the cost of those people is, any printing costs or communications costs or FedEx costs or whatever it happens to be. Make sure that you know about quality metrics and what the rework levels are, service levels, task times, process times. You want to know all that stuff. You don't have to overkill it, but you want to make sure that you have some idea of what it takes today to do the work, so that when you're done with your deployment and your redesign, you can prove that, hey, this was really valuable. So, and then, sorry, you also need management buy-in. Critical, of course, for any major project is to have management buy-in, have them on board, and have them ready to help you make the decisions that need to be made through any redesign process. And then plan your deployment. So once you've got everything defined, then you need the resources laid out. You need commitments. If a SME is going to need 50% of his or her time dedicated to this project for 6 months, well, who's going to do his or her work in the meantime? So you have to make sure you think through that resource allocation. So deployment, you have to balance scope, time, and cost. They're interrelated, and they definitely rely on one another. So to keep the scope refined enough so that time can be done, again, looking at just law in a fairly compact period, and then make sure that you know your costs and know what your benefits are going to be. What I mentioned earlier on the onboarding, there was that simple approach where you basically define what the tasks are, but you rely on people to manually say, yeah, I did this, or I didn't, or I forwarded it to this person. That's a really good way to keep that scope in line. Because one of the things you have to remember here is workflow is iterative, okay? That middle bullet here. Once you do that simple workflow and you're manually gathering the information as people, actually state that they did a task, at the same time, you're also gathering those metrics. So you're starting to understand how long it sits in telecommunication, how long it takes for the facilities people to get a cubicle set up, et cetera. You take that information then, and in the next iteration of the workflow, you apply the metrics that you've picked up, and you start making it a little bit smarter, a little bit better. So it is an iterative process, and it's really important not to overthink this on day one. So then post-deployment, you get your meaningful metrics, and you can compare them to your original and kind of see what you did. So one of my clients right now is they deployed, it's a higher ed customer, they deployed in 20 departments, and they quickly found out that they were resource constrained because the departments that went first wanted to do this next iteration, and they were demanding, resources, and they didn't have them. So it was a good problem to have because they gathered their metrics and they could show that their average payback was about 8 months on every deployment that they did. And this is a combination of ECM and workflow. Because of the high payback, they were able to hire 2 more resources and keep things moving forward across the enterprise. So hopefully that gets some creative ideas going for you all. So deployment summary. Yeah, good. Question, yes.
I'm sorry, so there was one that came in, and the scenario was when a sales return is entered, it needs to be approved by a couple of people when there's a refund involved.
Excellent. Yep. Yep. So a sales return, if you're in a physical world and you're wanting to get a return authorization, that may come in as an email. You have a return authorization form that has to be filled out. Maybe it's submitted as an email. Maybe it's on a, automated in a portal. But either way it comes in, the ECM system or workflow, probably there's an ECM system behind it or some kind of database that captures it. Workflow can monitor that email account or that portal location, and as soon as it comes in, pick it up. Look at the data. Say, okay, what's the dollar amount? If it's greater than X dollars, I can let it go through. If it's greater, it has to go for 3 approvals. If it's greater than, outside of norm, maybe it has to get a special look. You then can move that through to the return authorization stage, and workflow can send that authorization back. When it physically comes in again, you probably have a review process, and again, that can be workflow driven. When it hits the dock, they scan in the packing list. The ECM can recognize that packing list, know the workflow is waiting for that packing list to come in, and then trigger that approval process. So that's a really good example of, especially with return authorizations, where oftentimes you're sending out the documentation that supports the return. That documentation can actually be coded for the waiting workflow transaction, and when it's scanned in, when that receipt, that packing list comes in, and you scan it into the ECM, workflow recognizes automatically that transaction, picks it up, and then continues the approval process forward. So kind of throwing a couple of ideas out there, but that combination of, an ECM in the background watching that receipt of information or document information, or a database in the background that workflow is keeping an eye on, can trigger those approvals automatically. And if they're denied, then you go into a denial branch of the workflow, and if it's approved, it goes into the approval branch. Business rules execute, and messages are sent, and away you go. So hopefully that answered the question.
We have another question that came in, and maybe this is something, I'm not sure if it's something you want to tackle right now, but what should we keep in mind to find a good BPM product in the market?
Well, like any product procurement, define your requirements. You need to know, especially BPM workflow. You have to understand how complex your workflows are going to be, what kind of triggers you want to execute, what kind of business rules you need to be able to accommodate. How sophisticated are they? You have to look and see whether the system can accommodate very sophisticated business rules, or whether they incorporate a business rules engine, which you might need in a high volume insurance application, for example. It's really about requirements, and if it's truly BPM and you're touching lots of different systems, you have to look at how you communicate with those systems. And, are they web service enabled? Are they an SOA, service-oriented architecture solution that can be easily communicated with? So it's really about defining requirements, like any system decision. But I'm not going to kid you, if it's a complex environment, there's a lot of moving parts, and it's incredibly important that you define the requirements and then evaluate the vendors that can obviously meet those requirements. I hope that helps. I know it's pretty generic, but without more information, it's hard to be more. And I'd be glad to take that discussion offline, Jason, and if they want to follow up with specific example of what they're trying to do, I can certainly be a lot more specific. Okay, anything else? Okay.
No other questions at this time.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So the core team, in summary then on deployment, the core team must be empowered to make decisions within the parameters set by management. So to keep this moving forward, to keep it, to not break just rule, you got to do that workflow deployment fairly quickly. So that gets back to the 80-20 rule of getting out there, getting your analysis done, knowing what you want to do, and then deploying quickly. But from beginning to end, the deployment, you got to try to keep that within, that 6-month time frame. Depending on management buy-in, et cetera. Keep the scope reasonable. Resource availability, you got to make sure that the project itself is a priority, that people have the time to work on these deployment projects, or they'll stall out and you'll just waste time, you'll spin your wheels. You spin your wheels. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. Assess and refine the rollout approach. So the first one you do, you're going to be a little bit, coarse in your deployment. Learn from it, refine it. The next one's going to go a lot smoother. And document the benefits gained. So once you know that you've gained benefits and what your return on investment was, hey, toot your horn. Let people know, hey, we did this deployment. It was incredibly successful. let's get on board and make this make the next one happen. So it's really about continuous process improvement. So some resources here. There's on the left side, I've got some different resources that are out there: the Workflow Management Coalition, the BPM Standards Organization, the OMG, which you're probably all familiar with. IBM has a neat little book called BPM for Dummies. There's consulting resources out there. And then I just gave an idea of some vendors you could go look at that do various kinds of ECM and workflow and BPM and case management activities. So thank you. We'll take questions and answers that you might have. We got a few minutes left here.
All right, thanks so much, Jim.
You bet.
And yeah, to everyone in the audience, please do ask your questions, share your experiences as well. I think almost everyone's probably at least done something with automation in some way, shape, or form at this point, and we'd love to hear what your experiences have been. Jim, one question I did have while we wait for some more to come in. You mentioned the fact that if you don't act quickly, processes can change, people can change what they're doing, and you might lose your traction. I imagine that happens fairly often. And what are some of the things you can do to try to handle that situation when someone says, "Well, I have changed the process," or you do need to go in? Is it just simply a method of just making the technical changes to an automated workflow, or are there other organizational considerations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The nice thing about once you have them automated is those changes are typically a lot easier because you can, if business rules change or roles change or work distribution rules, changes because of a reorganization, for example. With workflow, you just go in and make those changes once, implement the new workflow on the day that you want, and you're off and running. Training's minimal, and it can be as simple as I want Sally to get this work now because she moved over from a different division to we want to outsource this to Ireland or India. We change it to go over there. So if it's in the middle of the process, we're actually in the middle of doing the re-engineering, you simply have to incorporate those changes into the process. It's never easy, and the more fundamental the change to the organization you're working with, obviously the more difficult it is. Mergers and acquisitions are often one of the big impacts on workflow deployments. Right in the middle of a deployment, suddenly you're buying another company and you want to integrate that in. You got to take a whole new set of people and technologies into consideration. So there are some strategies there, like get the first one done and then worry about the acquisition, that kind of thing. But business conditions drive that, obviously.
All right, we have a question from a member of the audience. Are there any good workflow products you would recommend for nonprofits with extremely limited dollars for software?
I'd probably start with SharePoint, because if you're in the Microsoft world, you may have it already, you may own it already, and Workflow Foundation certainly has some built-in templates that you can leverage. There are things like Nintext, which is a plug-in to SharePoint that does workflow on top of SharePoint and simplifies a lot of the design and setup and business rule definition stuff, so you don't need as much programming. That's probably the least costly if you have SharePoint that I can think of. Otherwise, I'd probably look at some cloud options. If they're a Dynamics user, I'd probably look at Alltech is an option, for example, which is a nice little ECM and workflow product. If they want to send me an email, there's a couple others I'd suggest. There's a couple of cloud options I could throw out there that would keep their upfront investment to a minimum. And,
all right, we're about at the top of the hour here, so why don't we see if there's one more question to sort of close things out. Otherwise, we will begin wrapping up. Here's Jim's contact information.
And
Jim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate the invitation to help your folks out.
All right. And we are recording today's event. It'll be available on demand if you missed any part of it. Thanks so much for joining, and keep your eyes open for other events coming up from msdynamicsworld.com. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you.